Why does GRIS look like it does? For this video, I'm gonna try and answer that question from a game art perspective and explain what purpose I think some of the design choices serve and then apply those principles. This means that we will not be making a one-to-one copy because we're not copying the art style, we're copying the underlying principles. Let's start by commenting on one of the first things I hear mentioned in relation to the game. It has a feeling of a painterly watercolor style. The question we need to ask ourselves at this point are what the characteristics of watercolor are. Watercolor loosely has two defining characteristics. First, it's a medium where you paint from light to dark, so the more paint you add, the darker it gets. The paint is translucent and lets the paper and texture through quite a bit. This image, for instance, was largely painted with watercolor and has the paper showing through quite a bit. Compare that to this image, which was painted with opaque watercolor, and isn't at all what we would think of when we say watercolor. In fact, we would call this gouache. So if you want to simulate watercolor, you need to keep that translucency in mind. Second, it's quite difficult to control the paint, so it often has natural imperfections, which people often like. The tricky thing then comes to readability, which is a term we use to refer to roughly how easy it is to distinguish between the player, platforms, and enemies. When you make a game, you have to take readability into account, otherwise your game will be horrible to play. Since the game wants the watercolor style, it would be difficult to use blur to separate the background from the foreground, the way that Hollow Knight does it. Because when you add the blur, your readability increases, but your watercolor feel would be diminished. Some solutions are just naturally diametrically opposed. They don't work together. So if GRIS still wants high readability and they can't use blur, a good way to solve it is to minimize clutter by having clean and simple assets. The extra benefit of low clutter is that the texture comes through much better, so we get an even better watercolor feel. If we were to have both texture and a cluttered scene, the look could quite easily become a mess, which you can see with this example from a test I've made previously. In my opinion, if you want a texture to feel and look good, you often have to adjust your entire style and approach to fit it. Another way games tend to improve both depth and readability is by reducing the contrast in the background, simulating atmospheric perspective. So high contrast foreground elements and low contrast background. Instead of this, we have this. But we have a choice to make here. We could either go light background, or we could go for a dark background. GRIS does both depending on the area. But let's look at the effect that it has. If we set up a scene and go dark, we can get this kind of oppressive looking feeling. It still reads well, but it has a different atmosphere. And if we go light, we can get something like this. And for many of the areas, they actually get more of that watercolor feel precisely because they go to a light background. Because watercolor paintings often have the watercolor paper showing through. I mentioned earlier that watercolor often has a lot of imperfections, and we can see that in GRIS as well. This style is often very loose, lines are a bit wavy, and not at all perfect. But when we see it, it doesn't look wrong, because the style is embraced. They have embraced the motto of Bob Ross: there are no mistakes, just happy little accidents. This doesn't mean that all lines in GRIS are squiggly and loose. In fact, the game very often have simple shapes like squares, triangles, and half circles. I've said in previous videos that I think that simple shapes are good because they tend to naturally read well, but in this case it goes further than that. Look at the trees here. Why do they have a square tree crown? We could say it's because it fits with the general style, but it actually conveys something more. It tells the player that it's a platform and that you can jump on it. Sometimes when designing an asset, you need to know ahead of time whether the asset will be interacted with or not, and make sure to communicate that to the player. And you don't need to make a perfect square like they have made in GRIS either. I've previously created this tree asset, which is significantly more complex, but it still tells the player that it's an interactable asset, that you can jump on it, because the shape language suggests that it's a platform. GRIS has a lot of thematic elements, and it would be difficult to discuss some of the design aspects without acknowledging these themes. So we will go into some light spoiler territory. But I don't think it should affect anything negatively if you haven't played this game before. GRIS has 5 zones, and each zone corresponds to one of the stages of grief. We have white, which corresponds to denial, red, anger, green, bargaining, blue, depression, and yellow, acceptance. These colors do map on quite well to how we culturally associate these colors. It's always good when creating an area to consider what feeling and theme you want to convey with that area, and choose your palette accordingly. If we look further than that, we could do some potentially pretentious over-analysis. So let's do that. We have these strong pointer shapes in the area corresponding to anger, which could be a reflection of the emotional state of the character. We have squiggly, jumbled lines in the area corresponding to bargaining, which could convey how our emotional state doesn't want to settle on a position. We are bargaining. Or perhaps it is because if we don't have these squiggly lines, the asset looks way too flat and kind of ugly. We could argue that the strong silhouette in the area corresponding to depression is a metaphor for how dark and oppressive depression can feel. But it also conveys strong borders for our playable area, making the area very readable. And lastly, we could argue that the last area plays with illumination as a metaphor for how, when having reached the stage of acceptance, we can hopefully look at the beauty in what we had while recognizing what we lost. I can't say whether the main reason for these choices were in order to strengthen the theme, or if we're reading into things and they were entirely design choices. For instance, the cracked structure could be signaling that something in you is broken. But at the same time, whenever I make structures, I tend to add cracks because it gives the structure character. What I can say is that each area does have a unique constraint corresponding to that area, and that some of these constraints do have utility from a design perspective. Further than that, I think it stresses a very important point when designing different areas. All of these areas still feel like GRIS. It is often easy when making a new area that the assets feel like they come from a different game. But in this case, it doesn't. A good way to go about ensuring this is precisely this way. You maintain most of the design constraints you have, but you have one or two unique ones for that particular area. Take a look at these areas. Often when you see reviews of GRIS, you hear comments about how stunning it is, and how so many in-game screenshots could literally be used as wallpapers. And these comments are right. How come GRIS has this abundant wallpaper quality, but you rarely see it in other games? What does "it could be used as a wallpaper" even mean? Well, wallpapers, or paintings, have strong compositions. They don't come about randomly because each thing in the image looks good, but because the artist planned for the image to have a strong composition. So if GRIS has several locations that look as if you could screen grab it, they most likely planned for that precise composition to exist. They essentially first created a good-looking image and then made it so that you could walk to it. And you could see this plan for composition quite often because the camera zooms in and out and stops to show that really cool looking image. Why aren't other games doing this? Well, the downside is that if you're planning for the scene to look good, it won't necessarily be fun to play. This level in Jumper is really fun to play, but it doesn't really look good. And if we tried making it look good by changing the layout, it might not be fun to play anymore. The situations where I think it can be cool to shoot for really good composition is during boss fights, because they quite often have open rooms, or in areas that are intentionally more slow, like when you're about to get a power-up in a Metroidvania. If we pick a few of these constraints, but create our own spin with it, we will be selecting these constraints. So in order to show the texture, we will have a few larger assets where we let the texture do a lot of the heavy lifting. We add some loose line work, and we outline some of the assets with random lines at the edges to ensure that they don't look too flat. We add atmospheric perspective by going lighter in the background. And then we plan for having a cool composition at a specific point. And just for the sake of it, I made a tree with square leaves. I'll also add that the difficulty when using textures is that it works really well for some type of assets, but can quite quickly feel like all of the assets are of the exact same material. The first time I placed these assets, I got this look, which has a feel to it, but it's a bit too much. I could probably find plenty of more things to analyze, but then the video would never end.